Hello, everybody. Welcome to this stream interview from Money and Macro about the global debt mountain. Now, I just already saw someone mentioning that few people possibly understand what even is debt if we talk in a macroeconomic context. It's super clear what debt is if we talk about us as individuals. I'm in debt, for my house, for example, that's a mortgage. But what is actually debt for a global or a macro economy? And who other to ask than Professor Dirk Bezemer from the University of Groningen, who happens to be specialized in debt and who happens to have been my PhD supervisor and who, you could say, happens to be the person who I learned most of my economics from. So Dirk, welcome back.
Thank you.
And can you tell us a little bit, what is global debt in a macroeconomic context?
Well, global debt is just the debt held by all parties in the economy, added up, and then in all the economies in the world. So in that sense, it's not different from individual debt. But there is a macroeconomic thing about it that you don't see on the individual level. And this is that if too many people are getting into debt problems, that might lead to macroeconomic problems. But if only a few people or a few firms are getting into debt problems, and they may go bankrupt, that doesn't have to be a macroeconomic problem. On the contrary, that's happening every week, and it's part of the normal economic process. So that is a big difference between micro and macro. It's the scale.
Yeah, and if I can relate it to the poll, because I held a poll which says, is global debt really such a big problem? Because sort of the reason for this chat is this graph that I will show people now from the IMF, which basically says global debt is at historic heights, and it makes a difference between public debt, so government debt. It makes a difference between household debt, so people, like you and me, and also between corporations. And so the poll was, is this really such a big problem that debt has increased? And, I could argue, I guess, that it's not such a big problem because not only has the debt increased, so has the amount of assets, because people, unlike a normal person who is in debt, that's a liability for this person. That's often a bad thing. But in the global economy, everyone's debt is someone else's asset. So maybe it's completely normal that if an economy grows, that debt also grows. And so maybe this is just a sign that the economy is great, better than ever. What do you think of that, Dirk?
Yeah, so partly I can go along with that. Debt is one of the greatest inventions made by humanity ever. If we couldn't make debt agreements, which is the same as credit agreements with each other, the economy could not grow and develop. And if all that debt, all that credit was used to be invested productively and to grow the economy, preferably in a sustainable way even, then you would see an increase in debt and an increase in the economy that was roughly at the same pace, the same speed, and you would not see a growth of debt faster than the total economic output and all the incomes earned together, which is the GDP, the gross domestic product. So this is why in reports by the IMF and by financial institutions, you often see reports of debt relative to GDP. That's the thing to watch. So growth of debt is okay if it goes together with growth of GDP, because that means incomes are also growing. And you need to repay debt from income, so that then there is no sustainability problem, no financial fragility problem, no debt crisis risk. But the thing is, debt has been growing much faster than GDP. So if you look at debt expressed as a percentage of GDP, I think in the rich countries is now about 300%. So 3 times the level of GDP, the level of all the income that we earn together every year is debt. And so that ratio, debt to GDP, has been going up. Yeah. And that means that the difficulty of repaying debt from income is increasing. And there's a number of factors that make that more worrying, which we will touch on.
Yes. So if I can sort of relate it back to how we look at debt from an individual perspective, this measure, debt to GDP, is a little bit like, if I get a better job, I have more income, then it makes sense that I have also a higher mortgage, and that shouldn't be a problem. So we're looking at a flow, and a stock is what we would formally call this in economics, I think, right? So a flow is something that changes over time, GDP or income, wage, and stock is debt. And this has grown tremendously, and this has a lot of people worried. And you have basically dedicated a large part of your research career to this issue, I think. Are you worried about debt to GDP levels in the global economy?
Yeah, yes, very much. So there, of course, the recent COVID management has added a lot of public debt to the global debt. But before that, there was a surge in corporate debt, so debt by companies, and before that, there was a large growth in household debt with the household mortgage boom in the 1990s and 2000 that ended with the 2007 crisis. At least in the Western world, that is where it ended. So all three kinds of debt have been growing, and that makes the economy fragile. That means it makes the risk of a financial crisis, or the risk that with some sort of other crisis, such as a war or climate problems, that the financial structure will collapse is larger. For instance, the increasing inflation. Yeah, go ahead.
Dirk, based on this metric, you are saying that the global economy is more fragile than ever, purely based on debt to GDP.
That, I think that's a fair thing to. So nobody knows the future, but fragility means that we are worried about the risk of a collapse of part of the financial structure of the economy. And given rising inflation, unexpected shock due to the war in Ukraine, and especially rising interest rates, which increase the debt burden. Yes, I am worried.
Yeah, and I think we will get to these different risk factors then, and also maybe to what cost is debt to be so high. But before we do that, the IMF graph that I have shown on screen from time to time when you were talking about these types of graphs shows these public debt, household debt, and corporate debt. And traditionally, sort of in the media, people worry most about public debt. But you, I think, have worried a lot about household debt. So can you maybe tell us a little bit more about why do we make a distinction between these types of debt, public debt, household debt, and corporate debt, and what are the differences between them?
Yes, it is right to pay a lot of attention to public debt, and even to the extent that when you read in the Financial Times or in newspaper coverage about debt, just debt, what is typically meant is public debt, not private debt. So you need to pay attention to that, because private debt is bigger than public debt in most countries. So adding up household debt and companies' debt is more than public debt only. The reason that so many investors focus on the public debt is that they've put their money in bonds, which is in public bonds, which is government debt. So this is the metric they are watching. And the second reason is that if a country cannot borrow anymore, so if it cannot issue bonds and finds parties to buy it, that of course would be a disaster for the country. Whereas if some private party cannot borrow anymore, that would probably still be manageable by the government stepping in and supporting the companies, banks, for instance. But the private sector will not easily step in and support the government when the government is in problems, because the private sector thinks that is much too risky, but it's the government's job to handle the risk. So that there is an asymmetry there. Public debt is at the top of the hierarchy of how important debt is for the survival of the country. Having said that, I think it's a big mistake to focus on public debt and to urge that public debt should be reduced, and not to pay attention to private debt, because that can be just as dangerous. Actually, the 2007 great financial crisis, the greatest financial crisis ever, was a private debt crisis. There was no public debt problem there.
Although lots of governments got into a lot of trouble, specifically, and this is no coincidence, as I'm sure you will explain to us, in Europe. So Spain, Greece got mostly into trouble there.
But that's because they needed to. Yeah, this is so the government debt levels of Spain and Greece and Italy. Well, Greece is the exception, but Spain and Italy, the big EU economies, were not worryingly high before the great financial crisis, but they shot up as they were supporting their banks, getting into debt in order to keep their banking systems and their financial systems running. And then when they had to shoulder the cost of the recessions that follows, so the cause was private debt growth, which the government let happen. Of course, this is not without the implication of the government, but it was not government borrowing by itself that led to the crisis. But government borrowing increased after the crisis, as they had to shoulder the cost of keeping the economy going when the private financial sector collapsed.
Yeah, and why did this sort of blow up specifically in Europe? Because I think Japan also did this. I think, well, you can also tell me if I'm wrong there, but I think China will start doing this. But in Europe they did it, and it was a problem. Whereas in Japan, most famously not.
Yeah, this is because of the unique relation in Europe between the central bank and government. So in the US, for instance, which was of course very seriously hit by the 2007 financial crisis, the government bought up a lot of bad assets, a lot of the debts that were not going to be repaid, so-called cash for trash programs. And this was funded by the Federal Reserve without a problem. So nobody ever doubted that the American government would be able to finance itself, would be able to issue bonds and to have them bought up. Also because the dollar is the world's money. That's another factor.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, during the euro crisis, so 2007 and 8 was the credit crisis in the United States. Then 2008, 9, and 10, it blew over to Europe, and then from 2010 to 15 was the euro crisis. That's really a separate phase in this global crisis. And this is when international investors started doubting that, for instance, Italy or Spain would still be able to issue bonds and find parties to buy it, so that it would be safe to hold these bonds because you could always sell them. They were assets that you could turn into money. So that means that the liquidity of the bond markets for Italian and Spanish bonds was decreasing, and therefore the interest rates on them were rising. Investors wanted to be compensated more for holding the bonds. And who had to pay these high interest rates were, of course, the Italian state and the Spanish state and so on. And so it got to the point where, given the levels of debt that these states by now had, they also had to pay very high interest rates on their debts. And this was going to be unsustainable unless the central bank, their own central bank, the European Central Bank, stepped in and said, well, if no private party wants to buy those bonds, we will always buy them. Not directly maybe, but from private investors, and later on also directly. And at the moment, the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, who was then the president, said this, we will do whatever it takes. From that moment, interest rates went down again because investors were reassured.
Yeah.
So that's a big difference between Europe and other countries which have their own central banks. So Italy and Spain don't have their own central bank.
So you're saying that when Italy and Spain sort of temporarily got their own central bank, immediately there wasn't a problem anymore.
That's right.
Yeah. And so this got me basically wondering, like, okay, if you look at these kind of debt levels, the main focus is often on government debt, but for many advanced economies, at least, that are not in a currency peg or euro type of arrangement, it's not the most important thing you should look at. Private debt is more important as a metric for sort of unsustainable asset bubbles. But should we also make a distinction then between corporate and household debt, or can we just look at private debt in general?
No, we should make a distinction between corporate and private debt. So just one step back, we should look at total debt, which is public debt plus private debt. And the reason is, just a quick recap, is that if private debt is too high and private companies and households get into problems, the government will have to step in and take over their debt so that the government debt will increase. So it's no good to say the government debt is low and private debt is very high, but it's no problem because the government debt is so low. The government debt will rise if there is a private debt crisis. That's almost automatically the case. So you have to add them up and then look at the whole picture. Mm-hmm. But after you've added them up, you should take them apart again because there are different dynamics. So we've just covered differences between the government and the private sector, and within the private sector, the difference between companies and households is, very roughly speaking, is that most household debts in many countries are mortgage debt. So they are not debts which will increase the economy's production. They are mostly used to trade existing housing assets, a little bit also for building, but on the total stock of housing, that is a small amount. So by and large, the growth in mortgage debt will just increase house prices and not do much for the economy's activity, except for consumption of those who own housing. And therefore, mortgage debt and household debt more generally is quite a dangerous asset class because it's not used in a productive way. Mm-hmm. It's used for consumption and it increases asset values, but it's not used for production and generating incomes. And so again, the question is, where will the income be to repay this debt? Company debt is different. Companies can also use debt in unproductive ways, and they do. But for a large part, company debt is debt that is used productively. They borrow in order to invest in capital goods, in machinery and
Yeah.
robots and so on. And that will actually grow the economy, create employment, and create the incomes, profit and wages from which debt can be repaid. So company debt is not so dangerous as household debt.
So if you do a case study, look at a country, something that we have, for example, done in when we used to teach courses together, you will look at debt to GDP first. Is it super high or not? That if it is, that might be a fragile economy. Then, I'm just guessing here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but then you would look at household debt and maybe in combination with asset prices. Then you would look at government debt, depending on whether or not it's in what type of monetary system it is. So for Europe, it's more risky.
Well, yes, that is one thing. Another thing is also what access does the government have to funding and who is the counterparty of that debt. For instance, Japan has a very high public debt, and also Italy, but a lot of it is held by its own citizens. And it's more dangerous when the government's debt is held by foreign parties. In the first place, if it's held in a different currency, then it means that this government or this country needs to earn that currency by exporting, for instance, so that they can repay the debt. And if they cannot export enough, that might be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But in the second place, foreign creditors, foreign investors might demand their money back by wanting to sell the bonds. And that's not as big a problem with domestic investors, by households and firms who hold the government debt. So this is why Japan, which has a very high public debts, has no public debt problem.
Yeah. But that always gets me wondering, like, if we talk about Japan, it might not have a public debt problem, or it clearly doesn't. Interest rates aren't that high on government debt. Inflation is very low. However, and this maybe we could getting into MMT territory a little bit, modern monetary theory, that is. And the perception that people have of that, which is often different than what it actually says. But a question that comes to mind is, how high can government debt then go? And I don't think anybody knows exactly. But do you think that the limit to government debt is inflation? So government debt can go as high as it, whatever, until you see inflation. I think that's one of the takeaways from MMT, at least.
Well, that you would have to ask to an MMT person. I don't think they would agree. But what you're saying here is that higher government debt at some point leads to inflation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the so-called fiscal deficit theory of inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's correct. There can be inflation for other causes than rising government debt.
Sure. Yeah.
So I would decouple this question, how high can government debt be, from the question, is there inflation?
Okay.
It might be the case that excessive government spending is leading to inflation, but there's a number of other possible causes. And I don't think you can put a number on saying this is the level of debt that's going to be dangerous. There was a very famous academic study years ago which tried to do that. Around 90-100%, I think, was the turning point that they apart from the mistakes in that study, this would be a grand average for many different countries. And it depends on what the credit standing of the country is. So how much access does it have to new borrowing? It depends on its export capacity, if it's foreign debt or domestic currency debt. So it really depends on too many structurally very different factors to give one number and say this has to apply to any country.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. And I will talk to someone who is actually an MMT scholar at some point to...
That's great.
But before I do that, I'm talking to you. So I was wondering, okay, fair enough. So we don't actually know how high debt can be, total debt to GDP, especially not public debt to GDP. But if you look at the world now, like what areas, when it comes to their debt profiles, worry you?
I think many so-called developing countries, which have seen large increases in their debt levels, and this is public debt levels, because in their foreign currency public debt levels are very vulnerable, especially now that U.S. interest rates are rising, and much of their loans is in dollars, so they need to pay the U.S. interest rate on their U.S. debt, on their dollar debt. And if those rates are rising, they will be in big problems. I think in the IMF report that recently appeared on global debt, there's about 100 countries identified that are going to be in problems. So those are the most acute problems. Sri Lanka is, of course, the country that is now in big problems, among other things, because they had borrowed so much and they are now. But many other countries, so about 100, are facing debt sustainability problems, and that is public debt sustainability problems, largely because in those countries the private financial markets are so underdeveloped that public borrowing is their most important source of foreign or dollar revenues, which they need to pay for imports.
So I think that this brings us back to how that it is like if the people watching that could have one or at least one of the most important takeaways is that look at, even though public debt is sometimes a little bit sort of overblown, the worry about it in some cases, in many other cases, it's still a super important metric to watch, especially emerging market economies.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When we look at developed countries, especially countries with who have the big five central banks like the ECB, Japan, UK, America in the first place, of course.
Yeah.
They have so much monetary power that they don't need to worry about their public debt as an immediate danger of hitting their survival constraints, so not being able to make payments, because they can pay in their own currencies largely. So there the situation is different, I think, and private debt there poses a bigger threat. In many countries, mortgage debts are quite high, corporate debts are quite high, and when interest rates rise and the debt burden also rises, then the proportion of monthly wages or profit that needs to be devoted to debt repayment, interest repayment, is rising, and that will bring many companies and many households into problems.
Yeah. And before we get to, because we also wanted to talk about, in relation to that, inflation and interest rates, before we get to that, we will take a couple of questions. But before that, I have still one more question now that we're talking about sort of global debt sustainability. So I'm working on a video about China and its debt crisis, I think we can say. Private debt crisis, household debt crisis for a large part. We were talking about these 100 economies. I doubt it's on that list of the IMF, but what do you think about the China debt crisis? Is it worrying? Because on YouTube, like the videos that dominate basically collapse, predict the collapse of China in a month. That's maybe one extreme, but what do you think?
Okay, that's quite dramatic.
Yeah, that's how you get clicks.
So experts also have been worried about the Chinese real estate bubble for many years. I think it was in 2016, there was another scare about the Chinese real estate bubble, which then seemed to collapse. I think 1 or 2 years ago, you had the Evergrande collapse. What is often not appreciated is the fact that most of the debt is really public debt, even if it's nominally private debt. So China could people are also predicting when Evergrande collapses, it's just a mega financial company, and it has connections to so much of China's productive economy as well. In the West, people were thinking if that collapses, it will take down the Chinese economy, or there will be very serious recession. But it collapsed or it just disappeared. But the Chinese government has the power to stop the ripple effects of that. So to support everybody around Evergrande even if they want to let Evergrande go bankrupt, basically. Mm-hmm. So it's a different structure there.
What gives China this power compared to other countries? Like, why does Sri Lanka not have it?
Maybe power is not the right word. Every government has that power if they want to, and this was very vividly demonstrated in the COVID crisis. Every government has the power to support its businesses or the business that it chooses to stop them from going bankrupt and to keep the economy running. That's exactly what most countries or many rich countries did during the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. So that's not a unique power. The thing is, China is, although it's a capitalist economy, it's a state capitalist economy. So the government is really underwriting basically the whole economy, and they don't have any theoretical or you might say ideological problems with using their state financial power to support companies, even if they are nominally private companies. Whereas in the West, most governments have problems doing that. even though since COVID, they've been forced or they've chosen to actually do it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm really smiling about this answer because I'm actually working on a video about this subject specifically, and basically I'm making the case that they're ideally, because many people compare it to the Great Depression in the United States, and I think it could be if you look at the private debt levels, but the ideology there was very different. It was like let it collapse and let the bad players
Absolutely.
weed them out.
Yeah. So the very last thing that the Chinese leadership wants is social unrest. Okay, so that's different from strictly financial economics. That takes us into the discussions of different territories. But social unrest is the thing that the Chinese leadership fears most. And in the 1930s in the United States, the government didn't care about social unrest or widespread poverty and unemployment. But that's something that the Chinese government will never let happen.
Yeah. And what about then if we compare it to some of the countries on the IMF list? Because I disagree a little bit with you, when you said like every government can choose to do that. I mean, if we go to a very extreme example, Sri Lanka cannot rescue an insanely large property developer, even if it's in Sri Lanka at the moment, I would argue.
Yeah, no. So sorry, I shouldn't have said that. And I completely agree with you that most countries actually in the world cannot do that. Most of the 300 countries in the world cannot do that. Only the rich countries can actually do that. So because they have credit, they can extend credit lines to each other on the central bank level, and they can support each other, as we've seen them doing during COVID, and also during the great financial crisis. But most emerging economies or developing economies cannot do that because they don't have the credibility to borrow enough to actually do that. So I would agree with you.
And finally, if we bring it, maybe we can link it to one of the concepts that we often used in some of our courses on international finance, the impossible trilemma, in the sense that China has capital controls, in a sense, so it's blocking capital flight, for example. It would just block that probably, and it also has, that's maybe a little bit separate, a massive current account surplus, which seemingly protected Russia from a complete collapse. So what do you think about these two factors also making China very different than, let's say, the Sri Lankas of this world?
Absolutely. The surplus, which is actually increasing now that Chinese imports are decreasing, but also the fact that China has such a large war chest still. This has been talked about for a decade and more, but it's still the case. There is no reasonable scenario in which China as a state cannot meet its international obligations.
Yeah.
So because it's the amount of dollar wealth that it has is so large, the amount of earning power, which is its trade surplus, is so large that there is so it has internal problems, and it has this, especially its growth model has increasingly depended on the real estate market. I think that is the real problem. So if the real estate market, which is fueled by citizens taking on, households taking on debt, if that process stops, a bit similar to what happened in the United States, 2004, 5, 6, then China has to find a new growth engine, and that growth engine will have to be domestic demand. But if many households are at the same time in debt problems, they cannot devote their wages to domestic demand, to consume from domestic companies. They have to pay off their debts. But then it might be an option for the Chinese government to do a large-scale debt resettlement, to wipe out a lot of the private mortgage debt. That's different. That's something that Western governments have never been prepared to do, even though their mortgage debt problems were also very large.
Yeah, I totally agree. So that video will likely come out tomorrow, and it will be largely consistent with what we have talked about here.
Okay, happy to hear that.
Yeah, I'm mostly saying that for everyone, but happy that you're looking forward to it as well. But how about we take some questions from the audience, Dirk? Shall I pick out a couple of good ones for you? An interesting question here, I think, is do you think that a world where growth is crippled by climate change and expenditure is on the rise to keep populations alive is going to exacerbate the problem? I guess referring to the problem of large global debt to GDP ratios.
I think that is very likely. And actually, internationally, central banks and the And the IMF and other international institutions worry a lot about the link between climate change and financial fragility, because clearly climate change itself, the consequence of climate change, such as the terrible droughts that we're seeing now, are going to lead to much larger spending levels, even if we don't change the system, and that is going to come down to government balance sheets in the end. Yes.
Here's another question. This is actually a difficult one for me, but maybe you fully understand it. Will the petrodollar be equaled by the natural gas euro?
That I would need more context and definitions to answer that. I guess. Let me just guess. I think the questioner is thinking of the petrodollar story, which was very much a 1970s debt crisis story, where petrodollars dollars earned in selling oil were used to make loans, and that was a cause of growing debt levels. And maybe there could be similar worries that gas euros earned in selling gas are raking up debt levels in Europe. But I don't think there is a clear analogy there.
Okay, well then let me see. Raoul has to clarify the question a little bit further if he wants more of an answer later. But before that, I have one person disagreeing with you, Dirk, so that should make for entertaining television. Anthony says, mortgage debt is very much productive debt. I buy a house, take a mortgage, rent out the house, make 1,000 USD per month. The tenant lives in the property, participating in the local economy, etc. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's a much more sophisticated discussion that we need to have in order to talk about the productiveness or unproductiveness of debt in general. I would say this on mortgage debt. If you take out a mortgage and buy out a house, and everybody does that, leading to an increase in house prices, then collectively we are paying more for the same house. I think that is the big factor in why mortgage lending is unproductive. It takes away from income that is earned in other activities in order to live in the same house. And the second factor is that if whether you rent it out or not, whether you live in it yourself, it is an increase in debt which is not matched by an increase in economic activity. The economic activity would be there anyway, even if you had not rented out the house, because the rent is just a transfer from the renter to you. It doesn't add anything to overall economic production. That is the short answer. I know there are problems with this answer as well. Mm-hmm. And Anthony and I would have to have a longer discussion to see where we agree and where we disagree on that.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. And then I see here one question that I can use as a small bridge into our next topic, which is inflation. So the question here is, what would be the consequence of canceling all student debt in the United States, which is a very hot topic right now. I think it's happening right now, or it's at least in all the newspapers at the moment. Very many economists are very much against this, and they're saying this will exacerbate the inflation problem in the United States. What do you think of that, Dirk?
Well, apart from the consequences for inflation, it would free a lot of people from debt problems, or from paying a debt burden, from having a debt burden. Whether or not that is right or wrong is in the end is a political question. That is one side of, and it would also destroy wealth for the parties who hold student debt. So those are banks and financial investors, and indirectly maybe people through their pension funds and so on. So those are the consequences, and so this is actually leading up to the inflation question. It's really a political question, and something is political when there's different parties and there's clashes of interest. There's different interests that go in opposite directions, and wiping out student debt is good for one group of people, students and former students, and it's bad for the wealth of another group of people. And some of those people may actually be the same people. If you hold a pension fund, hold pension claims, part of which are invested in student debt, and you are paying off your student debt, then you actually have to look at the balance.
But this, I'm not sure if you know, but I don't know actually, having more of a focus on Europe at the moment and China. But I was actually thinking when I read it, wouldn't the US government take on this debt? So then it would not per se be debt forgiveness, but more debt that's from students to financial institutions going to the US government? Do you know
Yeah, of course. So when we say debt forgiveness, what we actually mean is that some party will buy up the debt and then tell the debtors, the students and the former students, you don't have to pay this, or you can take longer repaying this, or you can pay a lower interest rate, whatever. Only the creditor has the power, the legal power to say this. So first, whoever, government needs to get possession of the debt claims of the assets before they can wipe out the debt if they want to. So completely say you don't have to pay this or something in between. You only have to pay 80% or whatever.
But then
So
I'm a little bit
right.
confused by the example that you mentioned, because you said if you own a pension, if you have a stake in a pension fund, then you have a negative consequence of this.
Yes. So if the government pays the full value of the student debt, there is no negative consequence. So the government would take on the extra debt, and the government, if it does that, so it supposedly does that in the national interest, it says nationally there's too much student debt, we need to do something about this. The government could choose to say, and we need to share the pain, right? So in the business as usual model, the pain is completely on the debtors. They simply need to repay the whole debt. And when you say there's too many debtors, there's too much debt, this is bad for the macroeconomy, we need to shift some of the pain away from the debtors, then would it be reasonable to shift it completely to the government? Or would you also let the creditors share in the pain? And then you would buy the debt for 90 cents to the dollar or something like that. And then that's where the pain comes in. And even if you don't do it directly this way, the government may choose to buy up the debt and then increase taxes. It needs to be financed in some way, which means that the payment obligations are shifted away from the debtors, either to the government or to creditors, with some proportions, which are political decisions.
Yeah. Okay. But then let's. Well, I'm not entirely sure how they do it institutionally, but I think someone in the chat might be able to help us out with that.
I don't think they're going to do it, are they?
I'm not sure. I just read the headlines that they were, but I didn't. I was, of course, preparing the whole morning for this interview, so I didn't read it super carefully. But let's see if people can maybe help us out with that a little bit, if they actually did it or not, in the chat. But before that, I just wanted to ask you about inflation, because inflation has really surprised many economists. Were you one of them, or did you expect inflation when first sort of COVID hit?
No, when COVID first hit, everybody expected deflation.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody, including in the Netherlands, there were predictions of a very serious recession, bigger recession than after the great financial crisis of 2007 and 8, which was a serious recession. So that was very dramatic. And in such a recession, house prices would start dropping. It would be deflation probably as well, more likely than inflation. Very soon, after the first few months, when government had stepped in, it was clear that there was not going to be such a serious recession. In the end, things turned out to be much more positive. You look at the growth path of the economy, it went down, but then it returned to the previous growth path. So in that sense, nothing was lost really at the cost of very large increase in government debt.
Yeah, and that overall, right?
And well, especially government debt. Yeah. And therefore, that brought back inflationary pressure, which was already present before this. But I think the real increase in inflation before the war in Ukraine was already mostly because of energy prices. It's a different story for the United States, but in Europe, wages were not a reason for increase in inflation because wages were still not growing very fast. And the biggest reason was the increase in energy prices because President Putin of Russia, was already playing a geopolitical game, creating uncertainty about natural gas deliveries before the Ukraine crisis. And this coincided with the restart of the global economy and global value change, which were not functioning well yet. And on the other end, there was all this money piled up in consumers' bank accounts because of government support during the COVID crisis. So there was too much demand, not enough supply, plus energy price uncertainty, and this combined into a rise in inflation after the worst of the COVID crisis seemed over last year. Mm-hmm. And I think the most widespread expectation, at which I also held, was that there would be inflation which would peak in the summer of 2022, so about now, in maybe the autumn, and then would go down again. Nobody would know exactly to which levels, but probably it would be structurally higher than the ultra low inflation levels that we've seen over the last 10 years, but nothing like we've seen now. And only when Putin decided to invade Ukraine and when the sanction follows and the whole disruption there, that's when inflation really shot up a lot in the first place. And also, it is now unlikely that inflation is going to, or that the high price levels are going to go away very soon. Inflation itself, so the rise in prices, may stop after a while, but the prices, especially energy prices, but energy goes into everything. They're not likely to come down to the levels that they were, because we don't want to buy gas from Russia anymore. Most European countries don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So there's going to be energy scarcity, so higher prices. That is likely to remain the case. Yes.
And that's mostly Europe and the rest of the world story, because the US has so much of its own gas. Although, of course, if a market is connected, it should be there.
Yes.
As well.
So the energy problem is so the energy from Russia problem is mostly a gas problem, and Russia sells most of its gas to Europe, nothing to the United States, I think, even. And also, the United States has its own energy supplies, much more than Europe. And in in the United States, to an extent, rising wages play a relatively larger role. I say this very cautiously because it's very unclear how large that role is actually.
But do you think that there is a large demand side story in the US?
Oh yes, I think so. Yeah, because demand versus supply story, because the global supply chain problem is also there for the US. So China is still in lockdown partly, and that's a big problem for US supplies.
No, but I mean more because you sort of alluded to, okay, inflation in Europe is largely an energy story, but US inflation has mostly been a little bit higher than European inflation. So what explains that US inflation then was also higher? Is there more stimulus in the US, or is that unfair?
So I say this all very cautiously because I think nobody really knows how much of what percentage of the inflation are explained by what factors. But I think in the US, it's a combination of the amount of money that the government has poured into the economy during COVID and the supply problems that are still important for the US economy, given that it imports most of a lot of its consumer goods.
Yeah. Okay, and then this is a final question within the time limit that we set. Then it's up to you. So this is a notification for you as well that your other appointments are also calling, even though I will still be here to answer questions from the chat as well. But interest rates, we haven't really talked about that, and maybe sort of the way I would like to start that conversation with you is: do you think it's the right move that central banks started hiking interest rates?
I'm very ambiguous about it. So the consensus is that central banks should bring interest rates back to normal levels in order to contain inflation. I think I agree with the first part, that it's better to have more normal levels of interest rates, but especially to contain the rise in debt. Because when money is so cheap, they have a rise in debt. That's a big problem. Whether that's the right way to contain inflation is a different issue. When the causes of inflation are really, for instance, largely energy prices, or when they lay outside the need for companies to borrow in order to produce, or the need for consumers to borrow and therefore the cost of borrowing, it is certain that vigorous increases in central bank interest rates will bring down inflation by causing a recession. And everybody is expecting recession in the US because of the rising interest rates by the Federal Reserve. The question is that the right thing to do? It means that most of the pain of containing inflation is then going to fall on workers, basically, while there's also super profits at the moment. Well, if you tax those more, you could also do something about the inflation. So that's a short answer.
Yeah, but I like to hear that, because I find myself a little bit isolated at some point, with discussions with other guests much earlier this year in Learning Economics. It was, I think, where I said, I'm actually not against rise in interest rates or quantitative tightening, but more to contain asset price rises than to contain inflation. And that's very much in line, I think, with what you were saying, right?
Yes, rising interest rates will also contain asset price rises, and that's bound up with the rise in debt because it's the borrowing that chases up asset price rises. Apart from the mechanical thing with bonds, that bonds prices go up, lower interest rate. That would be a positive side effect, but I'm more worried about, given the high levels of debt, a recession will have very serious consequences now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think that the right way to contain inflation is to cause a recession. But basically, that's what's going to happen.
Okay,
And
fair
I think
enough.
I think it's better to look specifically at the causes of the inflation, which is there was a study a while ago showing that in a concentrated economy, so an economy where fewer firms hold more of the market power, the feed through of prices is bigger. So if those companies face increase in energy prices, there's a bigger increase in consumer prices. So it's also the concentration in the economy speculation, which is also causing inflations. Companies which are making high profits and because they can pass on high prices to the consumers.
Okay, so this is the price gouging argument, I think, right? And I don't know too much about this. It makes sense, I think, that you shouldn't only look at labor, but also at capital, because the Phillips curve argument that they typically use is very much a labor story. This is more a profit story, right? And you're saying this is something that economists are looking at more now, I think, and you're saying, I think that they should do that. Is that correct?
The Phillips curve is outdated. The Phillips curve doesn't hold. There's no clear trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
Yeah.
And as you say correctly, look, if input prices are rising, companies can either increase their output prices, maintain their profits, or they can decrease their profits, and there won't be inflation. So if there is a trade-off, it's not so much between employment and inflation, but between profit and inflation.
And what would be a solution then? Price controls?
A solution would be but that's a longer-term solution, to fight against concentration in the economy. There's excellent research by Jan van Eekhout. The Profit Paradox is called. It's a book about why profits are bad for the economy in a very provocative title thesis. And it's because basically monopoly power. So many companies, especially large companies, of course, corporations, listed companies, are making profits, which are super profits in the sense that they could make lower profits and still be in operation and deliver the same goods and services, but they have so much market power that they can have higher profits. So we should have we already have quite a good understanding that part of the feed through of high prices into high energy prices, for instance, or high consumer prices, is because of market power, and that's what should be attacked. In the short term, it's very difficult to do that.
Could this also explain the inflation gap between Europe and the United States? Because if I remember correctly, there's much more concentration in the United States than in Europe.
It could be, yeah. It could well be, but that's an empirical issue that we would have to look into.
Yeah, so this is also something I did a lot of inflation videos looking at all sorts of channels, demand, supply, also something I like to call demand shift, because you had this huge demand change from services to goods. But I haven't looked at this, so thank you for that. At least I will have a more careful look at this.
Oh, so there's another thing about inflation that mostly in the public debate, people in the debate adhere to the monetary theory of inflation. Basically, is what Friedman said, that inflation is first and foremost a money thing. The more money chasing fewer goods. Another way of looking at inflation is that it's a distributional thing. So higher increases in prices are bad for some people and good for other people. The ultra low inflation target, 2%, that the ECB has, is not necessarily the best for the economy. And to have 3 or 4% stable inflation is good in many ways. It's good.
What? Why would that be good?
Well, it's good for everybody who has debt. That's the real values debt is going down faster. If it's stable inflation, it doesn't disrupt the economy. The real danger of inflation is that it's volatile, that price levels are changing, so you can't do long-term planning, and therefore businesses can do what they need to do. So higher inflation is good for debtors and it's bad for creditors. Again, it's a political thing.
Yeah, but one thing about that argument that always confuses me a little bit is, like, if it's stable inflation, won't interest rates just adjust for higher inflation? So in a 4% economy, you need to pay 6% interest rates on your loans, and in a 2% economy, you need to pay 4% interest. So it doesn't matter.
It could be, yeah. It could be. So so there's different channels. One channel is if you're a debtor, higher interest rates are good because your debt goes down. However, if the interest rates move with inflation, you have to pay higher interest. That goes against it. The balance might still be positive. If you're a creditor, you hate inflation. So central banks, by pursuing inflation targeting and setting ultra low inflation targets, have really been acting in the interest of creditors. For businesses, for productive businesses, having stable inflation of, let's say, 4 or 5% is not so bad. Actually, given the time that it takes to produce, and that meanwhile prices are going up, it's easier to make a profit, to make a monetary profit in an environment where there is moderate and stable inflation than in an ultra low inflation environment. So I think it's really a distributional variable. It's not so much a monetary variable only.
So one thing that I do wonder about that is that, and this is something which I thought was interesting, that we had this higher inflation now, is that I saw it more sort of on the micro level, if we talk like scientists, in the sense that, so you have this inflation number now of 9%, for example, right? But it's very different per product category. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your profits or your revenue as a business also goes up by 9%. That varies very much, differs per what category you're in, right?
Yeah, right. Of course. Yeah.
But maybe
so if you're losing a lot of energy,
that maybe then.
Yeah. Now, if you're a very energy intensive company like paper production or bakeries, they're in big problems now because of the energy prices, not because of the general level of inflation.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. But so if we, because I know you have other meetings to go to, but if we can end this talk about global debt on a high note, is there a way out? Is what I would ask.
Well, I'm not one of those economists who make predictions. I'm one of those economists who always says that nobody knows the future, but we need to assess the vulnerabilities and be prepared to deal with the vulnerabilities.
But I'm not asking for a prediction. I'm asking for a plan is more like it, right? What to do? It's not. I'm not sure if we will do it.
I think it's inevitable that if you look specifically at the debt problem, which is today's topic, that there's this great saying by the economist Michael Hudson, one of the people I work with: a debt that can be paid won't be paid. A debt that can be paid won't be paid. Mm-hmm. And it's the way that it won't be paid which matters. If that's not in an ordered fashion, it can do great harm. Bankruptcies and so on means also that debts are written off. So it's better to be proactive and to assess the vulnerabilities and to either support those companies and households in debt to pay their debt by transfers or to write off part of the debt. And I think that's the best plan forward.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And what about inflation? Can we inflate our way out of trouble? Or are we already doing that?
So a lot of the inflation now we don't control because there is energy inflation. And the best national governments can do is to support lower income households and companies who bear the brunt of the inflation, and to look for ways to finance that, for instance, by wealth taxes, which are long overdue anyway.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dirk. I can hear in your background that you have to get moving.
That's right.
So thank you so much for joining me here. I have noticed that there's actually much more that we have to talk about, or what we could talk about. We don't have to do anything, but I would certainly enjoy it. So I would love to have you on again at some point in the future, and I'm sure that we'll talk again. But for now, thank you so much for joining. I think this was extremely interesting, a topic that is not talked about enough on YouTube in a nuanced, fairly rational way. It's always doom and gloom, or you don't have to look at that at all. So thank you so much for that, Dirk.
Thanks for having me.